They laughed at the elderly man in the karate class, thinking he was just a regular spectator. But a few minutes later, the room fell silent when it became clear who he really was. Write in the comments where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new stories. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky with streaks of burnt orange and deep violet as the small town settled into its evening rhythm. On the quiet outskirts, where suburban streets gave way to open fields and dusty roads, a modest karate dojo stood nestled between a hardware store and a family-run diner. Its glowing windows spilled warm light onto the sidewalk, cutting through the dark like a beacon. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights mingled with the rhythmic sounds of bare feet slapping against tatami mats and the sharp cries of young voices practicing their ki. The dojo was a compact but well-kept space, lined with framed photos of former champions, old tournament posters yellowed by time, and inspirational calligraphy that spoke of discipline, respect, and perseverance. In one corner, a low shelf displayed trophies and medals, their polished surfaces catching glints of light whenever someone passed. The scent of disinfectant mixed with the faint musk of sweat, grounding the room in its purpose. This was a place for training, for focus, and for growth. That night, however, the atmosphere leaned more toward youthful bravado than disciplined practice. A group of a dozen students, mostly teenagers, were scattered across the tatami, chatting loudly and laughing among themselves while half-heartedly stretching. Their voices echoed against the walls, filling the space with restless energy. The youngest in the group, still white belts, glanced nervously at the older ones, imitating their stretches but staying out of their conversations. At the center of this restless energy was a tall, broad-shouldered 17-year-old named Travis. His confidence was as big as his frame, and it showed in the way he commanded attention without even trying. His short-cropped blonde hair was slick with sweat, his jaw set in a cocky grin as he demonstrated a spinning kick that came close to clipping his partner. The impact of his heel hitting the padded target rang louder than necessary, prompting whoops and hollers from his friends. "Did you see that?" Travis boasted, shaking out his leg. "That's how you knock someone down in a real fight." Beside him, his closest friend Mike, slightly shorter, stockier, with a mischievous glint in his eye, laughed and smacked him on the back. "Careful, man. You'll break the mat before you even hit someone." Their laughter drew in a few more of the older students, who circled closer. They traded stories, exaggerated punches, and teasing remarks that rippled through the room, gradually drowning out the quieter drills happening in the background. The young instructor, a lean man in his early 30s with sharp cheekbones and earnest eyes, called for focus, clapping his hands sharply. "All right, line up," he commanded, trying to cut through the noise. His voice carried authority, but there was an edge of strain beneath it. The students shuffled into loose formation, though their chatter barely subsided. It was at that moment that the dojo door opened. Few noticed at first, too caught up in their own energy. The hinges gave a soft creak as a figure stepped inside and paused just past the threshold. He was an older man, tall but not imposing, his posture relaxed yet steady in a way that suggested strength without display. His hair, tinged with gray, was cut short, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a face both weathered and calm. His eyes were sharp but gentle, scanning the room with quiet attentiveness. He carried himself with the kind of ease that only comes from a lifetime of knowing exactly who you are. He wore a simple training guy gray, unadorned, with no belt knotted at his waist. There were no patches, no marks of rank or affiliation, nothing that drew attention. He removed his shoes, bowed slightly toward the mats, and stepped inside, his movements unhurried. Without saying a word, he crossed to an unoccupied corner, settled onto the wooden bench near the wall, and folded his hands loosely in his lap. Though some of the younger students didn't even register his presence, Travis did. His gaze flicked toward the newcomer, narrowing slightly. Mike followed his glance and smirked. "Looks like someone's grandpa wandered in," Mike whispered under his breath, loud enough for the others to hear. A ripple of laughter passed through their group. The instructor glanced over as well, offering the man a polite nod before returning to the front of the room. To him, the newcomer looked like any other curious visitor, or perhaps an older relative of one of his students. He wasn't about to turn someone away for watching. Meanwhile, the older man remained perfectly still, his eyes tracking the students on the mats. His gaze wasn't sharp in a judgmental way but observant, the way one might study the flow of a river or the flight of birds. As the class continued with drills, Travis grew more animated, performing his strikes louder and flashier each time, always making sure the men in the corner could see. His friends followed suit, throwing exaggerated punches and laughing louder than necessary. "Hey, you think he's ever trained before?" Mike joked, glancing over his shoulder at the silent figure. "Maybe he's here to remember the good old days," Travis snorted. "More like he's here to watch real fighters for once." Shri. A few of the younger students glanced nervously between the boys and the man in the corner, but he didn't react. He simply sat there, his expression unreadable, his posture steady as stone. The instructor clapped his hands again, trying to wrangle their attention. "Enough talking. Pair up for sparring drills." The students shuffled into pairs, but even then the restless energy lingered. Travis smirked at his friends, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone. "Watch this," he said. "I'll give the old man a show." As the sparring began, the dojo was filled with the sound of bare feet sliding on tatami, the muted thud of fists against padded hands and sharp, eager ki. Yet amidst it all, the man in the corner remained motionless, his gaze unwavering. His calm presence was like a quiet counterpoint to the chaos, though no one recognized it for what it was. To the students, he was just an old man sitting silently in the shadows. But that was about to change. The dojo settled into a rhythm as the sparring drills began, the sound of soft, shuffling feet and the dull smack of fists against pads filling the space. The instructor moved along the rows, observing his students with a furrowed brow, adjusting a stance here, correcting a guard there. He called out reminders about balance and breathing, but his words felt like whispers lost in the undercurrent of restless energy that still lingered in the room. The older students, those on the brink of adulthood and swollen with confidence, treated the sparring like a performance rather than practice. Every strike was louder than necessary, every movement more dramatic than effective. In the corner, the older man remained seated, his back straight and his eyes calm as he watched each pairing carefully. Though his posture was relaxed, there was an unmistakable focus in the way he observed them, tracking weight distribution, reaction time, even the subtle tension in their shoulders before they struck. His stillness was a stark contrast to the restless shuffling of youth around him. Travis noticed. He couldn't ignore it. That quiet presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Every time he glanced over, he saw those steady eyes following the movement of the class, unblinking, unshaken. It wasn't mockery. There was no smirk, no trace of judgment. But that was what made it worse. It was as if the man was seeing through all of it, stripping away the loud voices and empty bravado to something deeper. The thought gnawed at Travis, and irritation crept into his veins. When his sparring partner ducked clumsily under his kick, Travis scowled and planted a firm shove on the boy's shoulder, knocking him backward. Laughter from Mike and a few others followed. Their laughter felt like fuel, stoking his pride higher. Then he looked again at the old man, still unmoving, still silent. The urge hit him suddenly, impulsively. "Hey!" Travis barked, his voice carrying over the sound of training. Heads turned toward him, even the instructor pausing mid-step. He jabbed a thumb toward the man in the corner, his grin wide, daring. "You've been sitting there all night. What's the matter, old man? Forget your G at home? Or are you just here to take notes on what real fighters look like?" The laughter that followed was sharp and immediate. Mike slapped his thigh, cackling, and a few others snorted under their breath. The younger students shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Travis and the silent man. Even the instructor raised a hand as if to intervene but hesitated, uncertainty clouding his features. The man didn't answer. He simply rose to his feet. The movement was slow, measured, unhurried, yet it carried a weight that silenced more than the laughter. The room stilled as he stepped forward, his bare feet making no sound against the mats. He stopped at the edge of the tatami, his gaze sweeping over the class briefly before settling on Travis. Travis smirked, though it faltered at the edges. "What, you want to turn?" The man gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The dojo was silent now, as though holding its breath. Even the instructors seemed caught between stepping in and simply watching. There was something in the older man's expression, a quiet certainty, a confidence so deep it was unsettling. Travis, fueled by the attention, grinned wide. "All right then, let's see what you've got." He stepped onto the mat, rolling his shoulders, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. His movements were exaggerated, every twitch of muscle telegraphing bravado as he squared off. The man stepped forward too, his stance unassuming, his hands loosely held at his sides, his weight evenly distributed. He didn't posture, didn't raise his fists, didn't give any indication of tension. He simply waited. The instructor's voice broke the silence, thin but official. "Begin," Travis charged forward. His opening jab was fast but sloppy, more speed than control. The man didn't flinch. He shifted a single step to the side, his body turning slightly, and with one fluid movement, his hand closed around Travis's wrist. There was no resistance, no impact. It was as though Travis had thrown himself into his grip. In the same motion, the older man pivoted, guiding that momentum forward, and suddenly Travis was airborne for a brief, weightless instant before crashing flat onto his back. The breath left his lungs in a harsh grunt, the slap of his body against the tatami echoing in the silence. Gasps filled the room, sharp and quick. The students who had been laughing now stared wide-eyed, their mouths slightly open. Travis blinked up at the ceiling, stunned, before scrambling awkwardly to his feet. His face burned red, a mix of embarrassment and anger. He barely paused before lunging again, this time with more force, a wild right hook aimed at the man's jaw. The older man barely moved. His left hand intercepted Travis's strike with surgical precision, redirecting it with a subtle parry. In the same instant, his right hand slid along Travis's arm, catching him at the elbow and turning his momentum against him. He stepped forward and twisted, guiding Travis down in a seamless arc. This time, instead of throwing him, he applied controlled pressure on his wrist, folding it inward until Travis found himself kneeling involuntarily, his body locked and frozen in place by pain that was sharp but contained. It was over in seconds. The man released him gently and stepped back. Travis stumbled away, cradling his wrist, his pride smarting far worse than the ache in his arm. He looked up, his chest heaving, but the older man had already returned to his calm, neutral stance, as if nothing had happened. The silence was absolute. No one laughed now. Even the instructor was frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. The man inclined his head respectfully, a simple gesture that felt heavier than words. Then, without speaking, he stepped back toward the edge of the mat. For the first time that evening, Travis didn't have a comeback. The air in the dojo had changed. It was no longer restless, no longer brimming with careless noise. It was heavy now, thick with something unspoken curiosity, disbelief, and an undercurrent of awe. Students exchanged glances, whispers barely daring to escape their lips. Someone muttered the name Chuck Norris, and the words seemed to ripple outward, a realization dawning like slow sunlight across the room. The instructor swallowed hard, his gaze flicking from the man to his students and back again. And then, as if to punctuate the moment, the man's eyes shifted toward Mike, who had been lingering at the edge of the mat with his fist clenched. The challenge in that glance was subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. The tension in the room ratcheted tighter. Everyone understood what was coming next. Mike's eyes flicked toward Travis, who stood rubbing his wrist and staring at the floor, his chest still rising and falling with the remnants of adrenaline. The cocky smirk that had adorned his face earlier in the evening was gone, replaced with a troubled silence. The dojo, once filled with loud banter and forced laughter, had gone deathly quiet. All eyes now rested on the old man, standing at the center of the mat, still calm, his breathing measured, his stance neutral. But something had changed. Everyone could feel it. The man hadn't uttered a single word, and yet with two effortless, economical movements, he had overturned the hierarchy of the dojo. Where before Travis had stood as the unchallenged top of the student pyramid, loud, dominant, revered, he now sat humbled on the edge of the mat, defeated by a man old enough to be his grandfather. It wasn't just the result of the match that had unsettled them, it was how it had happened. There had been no noise, no aggression, no force, Only control. Only mastery. Mike stepped forward. He hadn't planned to. It was more of a reflex than a decision, a surge of ego and heat that propelled him onto the mat before his mind could catch up. He had seen Travis go down twice in under a minute, and something inside him, some deep buried instinct, refused to accept it. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear disguised as bravado. Or maybe it was that ancient, foolish urge to reclaim balance through force. "I'll take a shot," Mike said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice had a forced steadiness to it, but underneath, it trembled. A few of the students looked at each other. One of them, James, a lanky brown belt with a high-pitched voice and nervous energy, muttered, "Don't," under his breath, but Mike was already stepping into position. The older man who by now several of the students were fairly certain was Chuck Norris, though no one had dared say it aloud with certainty, simply nodded and turned to face his new opponent. He didn't raise his guard, didn't shift weight. He simply stood, waiting. Mike tried not to show his nerves. He bounced on the balls of his feet, rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck. He told himself the old guy had just caught Travis off guard, that Travis had underestimated him, gone in too hard, too fast. Mike wouldn't make that mistake. He would be careful. He would be smart. He launched his first strike, a quick, snappy jab, aimed not to land, but to test. The man didn't react. He simply watched. Mike threw another jab, this one a little closer. Still nothing. Frustration edged into Mike's movements. He stepped in with a low kick, aiming to sweep the shin. The old man shifted weight with such subtlety that Mike's leg found nothing but air. In a blur of motion, the man stepped forward, guided Mike's arm upward with one hand, and with the other tapped him lightly in the chest with an open palm. It was like being hit by a tree branch, controlled, precise, and far stronger than it looked. Mike stumbled back, breath caught in his throat. "Again," he muttered and lunged forward. He led with a flurry this time, punching, faking, aiming high and low, trying to find an opening. But there was nothing. Every strike was gently redirected, every attempt at contact met with a shift, a pivot, a redirection of force. In the next moment, Mike found himself grabbed by the wrist, turned, and brought gently but firmly to the mat in a sweep that barely used any effort at all. He lay there stunned, blinking at the fluorescent lights overhead. By now, whispers were beginning to spread, with more certainty among the younger students. Someone pulled out their phone, checked an image, and passed it to another, then another. Each time the eyes went wide and heads turned slowly toward the man on the mat. It wasn't a theory anymore. It wasn't a possibility. It was truth. That man was Chuck Norris. Mike rose slowly, not out of humiliation now, but a kind of dazed awe. He gave a small, almost respectful nod and backed away. Then without a word, another student stepped forward. His name was Darnell. He was a quiet one, taller than most, with an athletic build and thoughtful eyes. Unlike Travis and Mike, he hadn't laughed when the old man first entered. He hadn't said much all evening. But now he walked to the center of the mat with a composed calmness that surprised even the instructor. His eyes were steady, and his voice, when he finally spoke, carried neither bravado nor challenge. "I'd like to try," he said. Chuck Norris looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly, he gave a nod. They squared off. The atmosphere in the dojo was now completely transformed. No one spoke. Even the parents who had been idly scrolling on their phones were watching intently. The instructor stood frozen by the edge of the tatami, arms folded tightly across his chest, unsure whether he should intervene or let it happen. Something ancient and sacred had entered the room. No one wanted to break it. Darnell bowed slightly and the man returned it. Then the match began. Unlike Travis and Mike, Darnell didn't rush. He didn't strike first. He circled. His hands stayed loose, his eyes focused. He was testing, reading. His movements were balanced and refined. He was no show-off. When he finally stepped in, he did so with precision, aiming a tight front kick toward the torso. Chuck sidestepped it smoothly, not in a hurry, just flowing around the line of attack. He didn't counter immediately. He let Darnell reset. There was something like mutual respect blooming between them, even in silence. The second exchange was quicker. Darnell feinted low and came up with a high hook. Norris deflected with his forearm and turned it into a brief joint lock, flipping Darnell off balance and sending him backward. But he didn't follow through with a throw. He let Darnell recover. The message was clear. I see your discipline. Darnell came again. This time he was faster, stronger. A combination of punches, low kick, and spin. It was a good attempt, but again the old man flowed like water. One movement became another. A parry turned into a redirection. A step back became a step forward. In an instant, Darnell found himself off his feet, then on the mat, pinned with a shoulder lock that left no room for resistance. The air left his lungs with a whoosh. But even before he was fully released, Darnell was smiling. He rolled up to a seated position, nodded and bowed low from the ground. Chuck returned the gesture. For the first time he spoke. Just one sentence. His voice was gravelly, but warm. You move with thought. That matters. Darnell bowed again, this time deeper. Now the instructor stepped forward. His face was pale and his jaw visibly clenched. He looked like a man caught between awe and disbelief. He cleared his throat, as if unsure how to speak. Sir, he said finally, I think we all know who you are now. Chuck smiled faintly, then looked at the rows of students sitting cross-legged on the tatami, their eyes wide and silent. Even Travis and Mike had bowed their heads, their arrogance thoroughly unraveled. And yet, despite all this, there was no smugness in Chuck Norris, no sense of superiority, only calm, only humility. He had demonstrated complete dominance, and yet never once had he used it to belittle. He turned to the instructor, gave a short bow, and said, They're good kids. They just needed to feel the difference. Then he stepped back toward the wall, taking a seat once more, as if the storm had passed and he was content to become a spectator again. But no one moved. The energy in the room had shifted completely. The dojo, once filled with noise, now sat quiet, not from fear but from reverence. The instructor looked at the students, then back to Chuck Norris. Would you, he began and hesitated, would you be willing to stay, maybe? Teach? Chuck looked across the room, at their faces, at the silence, at the hope. He gave the smallest of nods, and the lesson began. The hush that had settled over the dojo lingered like a sacred stillness, thick and almost tangible. The students sat in neat rows on the edge of the tatami, their knees folded beneath them, their hands resting on their thighs, their eyes fixed on the man who had just dismantled every notion they had of what strength looked like. Even Travis and Mike, who had moments ago strutted across this same floor like they owned it, now sat with their heads lowered, the swagger stripped clean from their posture. There was no laughter, no whispered comments, no restless fidgeting. It felt as though the entire room was collectively holding its breath, waiting. Chuck Norris remained standing at the center of the mat. He was motionless for a moment, simply scanning the room, his sharp but calm eyes meeting each student's gaze in turn. His presence radiated an unspoken authority, not loud or boastful, but the quiet dominance of a man who did not need to prove himself. His very stillness commanded attention, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady and unhurried, carrying easily through the silence. Line up, he said simply. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The students scrambled to their feet without hesitation, arranging themselves shoulder to shoulder in front of him. Their movements lacked the sloppy, casual energy they'd shown earlier. Now they were deliberate, precise, almost reverent. Even the instructor, who had spent months struggling to maintain discipline in this room, found himself falling into line, standing silently to one side as if he too were now a student. Chuck walked slowly down the line, his eyes on their stances, their posture, the way their feet pressed into the mat. His gaze wasn't harsh, but it was penetrating, missing nothing. He stopped in front of Travis, who flinched slightly under the attention. Chuck's eyes traveled down his legs, noting his weight too far forward on his toes, his knees stiff. Without a word, he bent slightly and nudged Travis's foot back with the edge of his own. Too much forward lean, Chuck said. You'll lose balance before you throw a strike. Travis swallowed and adjusted his stance, nodding quickly. Chuck moved on, correcting Mike next. His hands were too high, elbows flared out, leaving his ribs exposed. Chuck simply tapped the side of his elbow and guided it inward. Mike obeyed instantly, his earlier arrogance dissolved into earnest concentration. As Chuck progressed down the line, he corrected each of them with minimal words and gentle precision, his hands steady and sure. There was nothing rushed about the way he moved. Every correction was deliberate, every motion patient. He didn't just point out flaws, he showed them the alternatives, shifting his own body into demonstration and then guiding theirs to match it. His touch was firm, but never forceful, his voice calm and low, as if inviting them into a deeper understanding rather than demanding compliance. Once he was satisfied, he stepped back to the center of the mat and raised his hands slightly, motioning for them to mirror him. "Your stance is your foundation," he said. "Everything comes from here. Power, balance, control. If your stance is weak, nothing else matters." He flowed through the basic positions, Zenkutsu-dachi, Kibadachi, Neko-ashi-dachi, each movement smooth, effortless, yet rooted in a strength that was unmistakable even to their untrained eyes. His feet glided soundlessly over the mats as though gravity treated him differently. "Watch closely," he said. "This isn't about how fast you move. It's about how grounded you are." He demonstrated slowly at first, then gradually increased speed, his transitions seamless. His center of gravity never shifted wildly, his control absolute. The students followed, struggling at first to mimic his poise, but gradually they began to sync with his pace. The sound of their feet striking the mats became more uniform, their movements tighter, more focused. Chuck stopped suddenly, pivoting sharply into a low stance that exuded coiled power. His body looked perfectly aligned, no strain, no tension where there didn't need to be. He glanced up, scanning their lines. "Relax your shoulders," he said. "Strength doesn't come from clenching everything. It comes from knowing what to release and what to hold." They obeyed instantly. Then he moved on to striking drills. At first they expected him to show them something flashy, something cinematic, spinning kicks, high-flying techniques. Instead, he lifted his fist and threw a simple straight punch. It was crisp, tight, without waste. His knuckles stopped an inch from an imaginary target with such sudden precision that the motion produced a sharp pop in the air. "This," he said, "is the punch that wins fights." He had them repeat it. Over and over they punched. He corrected the angle of their wrists, the alignment of their hips, the timing of their exhale. He moved among them constantly, his hands guiding elbows, tapping feet, adjusting shoulders. His attention was granular. If even one knuckle tilted wrong, he saw it. When Travis punched, Chuck placed a hand lightly on his chest and said, "You're throwing from your arm. That's weak. Your power comes from here." He tapped Travis's hip. "Rotate. Feel the weight transfer." Travis tried again. The sound of his fist hitting the focus pad was louder this time, sharper. Chuck gave a small, approving nod. Mike stepped up next, and Chuck corrected his footing, narrowing his stance. "Too wide," he said. "You'll be rooted but immobile. Always give yourself the ability to move." The lesson expanded. They drilled elbows, knees, low kicks. He broke down each movement into its simplest components, stripping away anything unnecessary. When someone asked about a spinning kick, Chuck shook his head slightly. "High kicks look impressive," he said, "but the moment you lift your foot too far off the ground, you're vulnerable. Focus on what works when it counts." They listened. No one argued. Even those who had come in chasing flashy techniques now hung on every word, their egos completely dissolved. Finally, Chuck moved into joint locks and throws. He beckoned the instructor forward and demonstrated. The motion was so fluid it was almost hard to follow. One moment the instructor's hand was extended in a simulated strike, and the next he was on the mat, gently but firmly pinned. Chuck released him instantly, then showed it again, breaking it into slow, deliberate steps. "This isn't about pain," he said. "Pain is a byproduct. The real goal is control. You want to stop someone without unnecessary harm. If you can end a fight without throwing a single strike, you've done well." He had them a pair off to practice. Travis and Mike moved tentatively at first, nervous about hurting each other, but Chuck guided them through it patiently. He corrected their grips, showed them where to place their feet, reminded them to keep pressure steady but safe. Gradually, the room filled with the sound of bodies hitting mats-controlled falls. No panic, just trust in the technique. Between drills, Chuck spoke, his words sparse but heavy with meaning. Strength is useless without restraint, he said. Skill without humility turns into recklessness. What you learn here isn't for show. It's for discipline, for character. If you understand that, you'll be better martial artists and better people. The students absorbed every word. They had come expecting just another night of practice, of empty ki and half-hearted sparring. Instead, they were being reshaped, their understanding of their art torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. By the end of the session, their movements were sharper, their breathing steadier. The dojo, once filled with the careless energy of adolescence, now felt transformed. It was quieter, more focused, almost reverent. As they gathered for the closing bow, Chuck stood at the front, hands folded loosely before him. The students knelt in unison, their heads lowered, their voices unified as they recited the customary pledge of respect. When they rose again, every eye turned to him. There was no trace of mockery, no hint of the arrogance that had once filled the room. They were looking at him not as an outsider, not even as a celebrity, but as a teacher, a master, a figure whose presence had changed them in ways they couldn't yet put into words. Chuck gave them a single nod, a faint but genuine smile tugging at his lips. "That's enough for tonight," he said. The students bowed deeply, and for the first time since he had stepped into the dojo, the air felt completely still, anchored in something greater than noise or pride. The dojo remained still in the aftermath of the lesson, as if the very walls absorbed the weight of what had transpired. For a long moment, nobody moved. The students stayed kneeling on the mats, their gazes fixed on the man standing before them, their breathing slow and steady, their earlier restlessness replaced by something entirely different: reverence. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed quieter, subdued beneath the gravity that now settled over the room like a warm, grounding blanket. Chuck Norris stood at the center of it all, his posture upright but relaxed, his expression calm, almost unreadable. He looked at them, not as a man basking in admiration, but as someone measuring what had taken root during their time together. Their stances were firmer now, their shoulders drawn back with a newfound awareness, and in their eyes he saw focus where there had once been only idle competition and arrogance. He gave a small nod, and in that simple gesture, the room seemed to exhale. The instructor was the first to speak. His voice was soft, hushed as if he feared breaking the fragile balance that had formed. "Thank you," he said, bowing low with a sincerity that came from deep in his chest. "I don't know if they truly understood what they were learning before tonight. I don't even know if I did." Chuck inclined his head slightly, a faint glimmer of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "You've done good work here," he replied. "They have spirit. They just needed direction." The instructor bowed again, unable to hide the gratitude etched on his face. Around them, the students shifted, their movements careful and deliberate, almost ceremonial. They lined up instinctively for the formal closing of class, their knees pressing into the mats as they lowered themselves into sisa. For once, they did not fidget. They did not whisper or glance at each other. Their attention was wholly fixed forward, anchored on Chuck. "Ray," the instructor commanded softly. Together, every student bent forward in a deep bow, foreheads nearly touching the mats. The sound of their movement was unified, almost ritualistic, and in that moment, even Travis and Mike, once the loudest voices in the room, seemed humbled to their core. When they rose again, their eyes shone differently. Not with the misplaced bravado of boys eager to prove themselves, but with respect earned through quiet revelation. Travis was the first to break the silence among them. His voice was subdued, stripped of its usual swagger, carrying a hesitant edge. "Sir," he began, his gaze lowered, I didn't know who you were." He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "But even if I had, I wouldn't have understood." Chuck studied him for a moment. There was no judgment in his eyes, only the steady calm of someone who had heard confessions like this countless times before. He stepped closer and placed a hand lightly on Travis's shoulder, a gesture firm enough to be grounding, yet gentle enough to reassure. Understanding doesn't come from knowing a name, Chuck said evenly. It comes from seeing for yourself. Tonight, you saw? Travis nodded quickly, a flush of relief spreading across his face. His fingers flexed slightly at his sides as though words still failed him, and instead he bowed again, this time so deeply it seemed to come from his very core. Mike followed suit, bowing in silence, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. Even Darnell, who had carried himself with quiet composure from the beginning, lowered his head once more, this time not just in respect for skill, but for the deeper lesson they had all absorbed. Chuck looked across them, then at the instructor. Discipline, he said simply. That's what binds all of this together. Without it, strength is chaos. The instructor nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. They won't forget this. Chuck took a step back and scanned the room one final time. The photographs on the walls, the faded images of past tournaments and distant masters seemed to look back at him in quiet approval. The trophies gleamed faintly in the soft fluorescent light, their metallic shine muted but proud. And beneath it all, the dojo felt alive again, renewed, as though some old truth buried in its foundations had been unearthed. He turned toward the door, his movements unhurried, his demeanor unchanged. He didn't bask in the silence that followed him, didn't linger for thanks or applause. He simply walked. His bare feet met the polished wood of the walkway beyond the mats, and his hand brushed briefly over the doorframe as he reached the exit. Behind him, the students rose instinctively to their feet, watching. No one dared speak. Even their breathing seemed careful, hushed, as though they feared shattering the moment. Sensei, Travis said quietly, his voice trembling in its sincerity. Will he come back? The instructor hesitated, glancing at Chuck's retreating figure, then smiled faintly. Maybe, he answered. But whether he does or not isn't the point. The door opened with a soft creak, and Chuck stepped out into the cool night air. The sound of cicadas drifted faintly in from the street, mingling with the distant hum of tires on asphalt. He paused for just a second, tilting his head slightly back toward the room, as though acknowledging the weight of their gazes, even without turning. Then he walked away, his silhouette fading slowly into the shadows beyond the street lamps, quiet and unassuming, like a man who had never been there at all. Inside, the dojo remained utterly silent. For nearly a full minute, no one spoke, no one moved. Then, almost as one, the students exhaled. They felt different. The room felt different. The noisy energy that had once dominated their training was gone, replaced by something deeper, a respect not born of fear, but of understanding. The instructor clapped his hands softly, bringing their attention back. Clean the mats, he said, his voice still subdued. They obeyed instantly, moving with an efficiency that surprised even him. There was no dragging of feet, no muttered complaints, only quiet focus. As they worked, Travis glanced at Darnell, his expression earnest. I didn't get it before, he admitted. I thought all this was about, I don't know, looking tough. He shook his head. But that guy, he didn't even look like he was trying. Darnell smiled faintly, his eyes thoughtful. That's the point, he said. He doesn't need to. Mike, wiping down a section of the tatami, nodded slowly. I'll be here early tomorrow, he said. I've got a lot to fix. The instructor overheard them, and though he said nothing, a quiet sense of pride stirred in his chest. He had seen many nights in this dojo, nights of sweat, of noise, of half-hearted drills. But this night felt different. This was the kind of night that shifted things at their core. When the mats were clean and the gear was put away, the students filed out into the cool Texas night one by one. Their voices were low, their steps measured, their laughter absent but replaced by something quieter and more lasting. Inside the empty dojo, the instructor lingered. He stood in the center of the mats, staring at the spot where Chuck had stood, and let the silence wash over him. He bowed once, deeply, to no one in particular, and felt the weight of the gesture settle into him like a promise. That night, every student carried the same promise home with them, not to strike harder, not to kick higher, not to win fights, but to remember what they had seen, the quiet control, the precision without excess, the strength that required no showmanship. By the time the lights were shut off and the doors locked, The dojo had changed, and so had they. Respect hung in the air even after the room was empty, a lingering echo of a lesson that required no words. It was not fear, not awe, but something purer, a silence born from the realization that true strength doesn't need to shout. That night, they all learned it, and none of them would ever forget. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more powerful tales like this, and don't forget to share this video with your friends so they can experience it too.